Dr. Thomas Blackwood found a woman freezing to death in the Montana wilderness. But when she awoke, she recognized him despite his 15 years in isolation. What dangerous secret has followed her through the snow to his remote cabin? The axe bit deep into the frozen log, sending splinters flying across the snow-covered yard. Thomas Blackwood yanked it free and swung again, his breath clouding in the bitter Montana air. He needed more firewood before nightfall, when the temperature would drop low enough to freeze a man's blood. A lone wolf howled in the distance, making Thomas pause. Winter of 1885 had arrived early and harsh. 3 weeks now, the snow hadn't stopped. He glanced at the heavy gray clouds hanging low over the pine trees. More snow coming. 15 years he'd lived alone in this cabin, hidden away from the world that had once known him as Dr. Blackwood, the promising young physician from Chicago. 15 years since he'd failed to save his wife Sarah and their baby girl from scarlet fever. 15 years of punishment he'd given himself. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying a strange sound across the clearing. Thomas tilted his head, listening. Not a wolf, not a hunting cat. Something human? He dropped the axe and reached for his rifle, leaning against the woodpile. Strangers meant trouble, especially in winter. The nearest town, Silverton, lay 20 miles south through mountain passes that only fools would travel in this weather. The sound came again, a weak cry carried on the wind. "Hello!" Thomas called out, his voice rough from disuse. He spoke to himself sometimes, but rarely had cause for real conversation. "Anyone there?" No answer came, but Thomas's eyes caught a flash of movement at the edge of the tree line. Something that didn't belong amid the white and brown landscape. A splash of deep blue. Thomas trudged through knee-deep snow, rifle ready. As he neared the trees, his heart jumped into his throat. Not something. Someone. Half buried in a snowdrift lay a woman, her blue dress crusted with ice, her face nearly as white as the snow around her. Dark hair spilled across the ground, frozen in places to the earth beneath. "Ma'am!" Thomas knelt beside her, setting his rifle down. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. A faint moan escaped her blue-tinged lips. Thomas pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. Faint, but present. How long had she been out here? How had she even reached this remote spot miles from any road? No horse nearby, no traveling companions. He scanned the area and spotted a small leather satchel partially buried in snow. A few yards away lay pieces of what looked like a broken sleigh, no, too small. A carriage, perhaps, reduced to splinters. "Miss, I'm going to move you now," Thomas said, though he doubted she could hear. "Got to get you warm." He scooped her into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her many layers of clothing. Much too fine for mountain weather. City clothes. A lady's clothes. As he lifted her, something fell from her coat pocket. A folded paper, sealed with wax. Thomas shifted her weight carefully to retrieve it, tucking it inside his own coat. The woman's head lolled against his chest as he carried her through the deepening snow toward his cabin. Her skin felt like ice against his hand. "Bad sign. Very bad. Stay with me," he murmured. "Just a little further now." Inside the cabin, Thomas laid her gently on his bed. The single room held only basic furnishings: the bed, a table with 2 chairs, a chest for his few clothes, and the iron stove that provided both heat and a cooking surface. Working quickly, Thomas built up the fire in the stove until the metal sides glowed red. Then came the difficult part. The woman's clothes were soaked through. If he didn't remove them, the moisture would only keep her cold, possibly freezing against her skin. But Thomas had lived alone so long. The thought of undressing an unconscious woman made his hands shake. "Forgive me, miss," he said quietly. "Doctor's duty." His medical training took over as he gently removed her outer garments, a fur-lined coat of fine quality, the ice-stiffened blue dress beneath, leather boots that must have cost more than Thomas earned in a year from his trap lines. He left her cotton undergarments in place, quickly wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her skin remained frighteningly cold to the touch. Hypothermia had set in deep. Thomas had seen it before during his medical practice in Chicago. Street people brought in frozen nearly solid, their hearts slowing as their bodies shut down to preserve what little heat remained. He heated water in his largest pot, then filled his hot water bottle, a luxury he'd kept from his previous life, and placed it near her core. He considered his options. Body heat would help, but the impropriety of it made him hesitate. The woman's breathing became more labored. Propriety be damned. Thomas removed his own wet outer layers, then slipped under the blankets beside her, keeping a thin blanket between them for decency. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to share his warmth. "Don't you die on me?" he whispered, the words catching in his throat. How long since he'd spoken to another human being? The trappers who bought his furs each spring barely counted as conversation. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the crackling of the fire and the woman's shallow breathing. Thomas found himself studying her face, young, perhaps mid-20s, with delicate features that spoke of wealth and gentle living. A small scar marked her chin, barely visible. Her hands, though cold, showed no signs of labor's calluses. What was someone like her doing in the Montana wilderness in winter? Alone? Thomas remembered the paper he'd retrieved. Keeping one arm around the woman, he used his free hand to withdraw the folded page from his coat pocket. The wax seal bore an ornate W pressed into deep red. Breaking the seal felt like an invasion of privacy, but Thomas needed answers. Perhaps there was family to contact, someone who could explain her presence. He unfolded the paper, revealing elegant handwriting. "Catherine, father passed yesterday. Hawthorne moving quickly to seize control of everything. Claims father's heart simply gave out, but I suspect otherwise. The safety patents are missing from the safe. Do not return to Chicago. Hawthorne's men watching train stations and roads. Father's last words were about you finding the mountain doctor. I believe he meant Dr. Blackwood, who saved Mother years ago. If rumors are true, he lives as a hermit somewhere near Silverton, Montana territory. Stay safe. I will stall as long as possible. Your loving sister, Eliza." Thomas's breath caught. The mountain doctor. The letter was looking for him. This woman, Catherine, had been searching for him specifically. But why? And how did she know him? Thomas folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The mystery would have to wait. First, he needed to ensure Catherine survived the night. Hours passed as Thomas maintained his vigil. Twice he rose to add wood to the stove, returning quickly to provide warmth. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the deathly chill began to leave Catherine's body. As night settled fully over the mountains, Thomas noticed sweat beading on her forehead. Fever often followed extreme cold as the body fought to regulate its temperature. He dampened a cloth and placed it on her brow. "Thomas," she murmured, though her eyes remained closed. He froze. Had she spoken his name? Impossible. She couldn't know him. Yet the letter mentioned a Dr. Blackwood who had saved her mother. "Rest easy," he said softly. "You're safe now." Catherine's eyes fluttered open briefly, amber-colored, unfocused before closing again. But in that brief moment of consciousness, Thomas saw something that sent a chill down his spine. Recognition. Outside, the wolf howled again, closer now. The sound mingled with the wind picking up strength, howling around the cabin's corners. A blizzard moving in, trapping them together for days perhaps. Thomas settled back beside Catherine, watching the cabin's shadows dance across her face. Who was she really? And what dangerous secret had followed her through the snow to his doorstep? Dawn broke with painful brightness, sunlight reflecting off fresh snow that had fallen during the night. Thomas stirred from his uncomfortable position in the chair beside the bed. Sometime during the early morning hours, he'd moved there after Catherine's fever had broken. She still slept, her breathing steady now. Color had returned to her cheeks, too much color. The fever hadn't fully released its grip. Thomas stretched his stiff muscles and moved to the stove. The fire had burned low, the cabin's temperature dropping. He added wood carefully, trying not to make noise. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast. He took dried venison from his stores and put coffee on to boil. Simple food for simple living. As he worked, Thomas found his gaze returning to the mysterious woman in his bed. Catherine. The name suited her somehow, refined but with strength underlying it. The letter bothered him more than he cared to admit. Dr. Blackwood, who saved Mother years ago. He tried to recall all the patients he'd treated in Chicago. Hundreds, maybe thousands of faces blurred together in his memory. A soft moan drew his attention back to the bed. Catherine stirred, one hand emerging from the blankets to touch her forehead. Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Miss, can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, those striking amber eyes, and fixed on him with startling clarity. No confusion, no fear, just recognition. "Dr. Blackwood," she whispered, voice cracking from dryness. "You're real. They said you'd become a ghost." Thomas felt the floor tilt beneath him. "You know me?" She attempted to sit up but fell back weakly. "Water, please." Thomas filled a cup from his water bucket and helped her drink, supporting her head gently. "Small sips," he instructed, the doctor in him taking over. After drinking, Catherine sank back against the pillow. "You don't remember me," she said. Not a question but a statement. "Should I?" Thomas set the cup aside, studying her face for anything familiar. "I was 10 years old. You came to our house on Lakeshore Drive when my mother couldn't breathe. The other doctors said nothing could be done." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "You saved her life." Thomas frowned, searching his memories. Lakeshore Drive meant wealth, the cream of Chicago society. Then suddenly, like a match struck in darkness, the memory flared to life. "Winfield," he said slowly. "Your mother was Eleanor Winfield. Diphtheria. The other doctors had given up, but I tried an experimental treatment." Catherine nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "Mother lived another 8 years because of you. Father never forgot." Thomas sat heavily in the chair. Edward Winfield had been one of Chicago's industrial titans, steel mills, railroads, shipping, the kind of wealth that shaped cities. "Your letter," Thomas said. "It mentioned your father passed away." Catherine's eyes widened. "You read my letter?" "It fell from your pocket when I found you. I needed to know if there was family to contact." Thomas retrieved the paper from the table. "It says your father's partner, Hawthorne, is trying to take control of the business, and that you were specifically looking for me." "Why?" Catherine attempted to sit up again, this time succeeding with Thomas's help. She pulled the blankets tighter around herself, suddenly aware of her state of undress. "Your clothes are drying," Thomas explained quickly, feeling heat rise to his face. "They were soaked through. I had to remove them. Doctor's duty," he added awkwardly. Catherine nodded. "Thank you for saving my life, Dr. Blackwood. Again, it seems the Winfield family is in your debt." "What happened out there?" Thomas asked. "How did you end up half frozen on my property?" Catherine's gaze drifted to the window, tracking the patterns of sunlight on snow. "I took the train to Silverton. There was a man there, Jenkins, at the general store, who told me a hermit doctor lived up in these mountains. I hired a driver with a small sleigh to bring me as close as he could." Thomas knew Jenkins. The storekeeper bought furs from him each spring when he made his twice-yearly trip to town. "The driver refused to come all the way," Catherine continued. "Said the pass was too dangerous. He left me at the base of the trail with directions." She closed her eyes briefly. "I thought I could make it on foot. I underestimated the cold, the distance. And the sleigh pieces I saw? Not my sleigh. I found it broken on the trail. Recent, I think. Someone else had traveled that way before me." A shadow crossed her face. "I suspect I was followed from Chicago." Thomas felt unease settle in his stomach. "Your letter mentioned Hawthorne's men watching stations and roads. James Hawthorne was my father's business partner for 15 years, Catherine explained. He always resented that father maintained controlling interest in the company. When father began developing new safety measures for the mills, measures that would cost money to implement, Hawthorne fought him at every turn." Thomas poured a cup of coffee and offered it to Catherine, who accepted with grateful hands. The warmth seemed to strengthen her. 3 weeks ago, Father told me he had proof that Hawthorne had been sabotaging the safety trials, even causing accidents to make the new measures appear flawed. Catherine's fingers tightened around the cup. The next morning, Father was found dead in his study. Heart failure, they said. And you don't believe it, Thomas said. Catherine met his gaze directly. My father was 62 and healthy as a horse. He never had heart troubles a day in his life. People can have heart problems without showing symptoms, Thomas said carefully. Father kept meticulous records of his health. Daily journals dating back 20 years. Catherine's voice strengthened with conviction. The night before he died, he told me he'd hidden evidence against Hawthorne in his personal safe, along with the patents for the safety improvements. After his death, the safe was empty except for his will. Thomas moved to stoke the fire, giving himself time to think. And you believe I can help you prove your father was murdered? Father's last words to my sister were about finding the mountain doctor. Finding you. Catherine set the empty cup aside. I believe he trusted you to help us expose Hawthorne. A knock at the door startled them both. Thomas grabbed his rifle, motioning for Catherine to stay silent. No one visited his cabin. Ever. Through the window, he caught sight of two men on horseback. Strangers, well-dressed despite the wilderness setting. One held a rifle casually across his saddle. "Hello, the cabin," called the leader, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard. "Wondering if you've seen a young woman in these parts? We're searching for our employer's daughter. Ran off after her father died. Not right in the head with grief." Thomas felt Catherine's hand grip his arm, her fingers digging in with fear. He gave her a reassuring nod before moving to the door, opening it just enough to be heard while blocking any view of the cabin's interior. "Haven't seen anyone," Thomas called back. "No one comes up this way in winter." The bearded man studied Thomas with cold eyes. "Mind if we warm ourselves a bit? Been riding since dawn." "Sorry," Thomas replied. "Got sickness in here. Wouldn't want to expose you gentlemen." The men exchanged glances. "What kind of sickness?" asked the second man suspiciously. "Mountain fever," Thomas answered without hesitation. "Nasty business. Starts with coughing fits, then the blood comes. Usually fatal within days." The men backed their horses a few steps. "If you see a young woman, dark hair, city clothes," said the leader, "there's $50 for information. She's unwell, needs her family." Thomas nodded. "I'll keep an eye out. Though like I said, no one comes up this way in winter." The men turned their horses, but not before the leader gave the cabin a final, searching look. "We're staying in Silverton at the hotel. Name's Smith. John Smith." Thomas waited until they'd disappeared among the trees before closing and barring the door. He turned to find Catherine standing by the bed, blanket wrapped around her, face pale with fear. "Hawthorne's men," she whispered. "Likely," Thomas agreed. "But they're gone for now." "They'll be back," Catherine said with certainty. "Smith isn't his real name. That was Victor Reed, Hawthorne's head of security." Thomas moved to the window, watching the men's tracks disappear into the forest. "How did they find you so quickly?" "I don't know." Catherine sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The hotel clerk in Silverton must have talked. Thomas ran a hand through his beard. 15 years he'd lived in peaceful isolation, and now danger had found his doorstep in the form of a woman with amber eyes who somehow knew him. "We need to move you," he said decisively. "Once your clothes are dry. There's a trapper's cabin about 5 miles west. Abandoned now, but solid enough. We can hide you there while I find out what these men really want." Catherine shook her head. "I can't ask you to risk yourself for me." "You already have," Thomas pointed out. "By coming here." Their eyes met across the small cabin. Something unspoken passed between them, recognition of a turning point. Thomas had turned his back on the world 15 years ago. Now the world had found him anyway, in the form of a half-frozen woman with secrets and dangerous men on her trail. "Why did you really leave Chicago, Dr. Blackwood?" Catherine asked softly. "You were rising in reputation. sought after by the city's finest families. Thomas turned away, the familiar pain rising in his chest. Some failures cut too deep to stay and face every day. "Your wife and daughter," Catherine said, surprising him. "I remember my mother telling me." "I'm sorry." Thomas was saved from responding by a sound outside, horses approaching again. Too soon for the men to have gone far and returned. He moved swiftly to the window. 3 new riders emerged from the trees. These dressed differently, rough clothes, unshaved faces. Mountain men, not city dwellers. One spotted Thomas in the window and raised his hand in greeting. "Thomas Blackwood. Need your help, man. Jenkins from town sent us. Got a boy hurt bad from a falling tree." Thomas hesitated, looking back at Catherine. Doctor's duty pulled against his need to protect her. "Go," she said softly. "I'll be fine." Thomas grabbed his medical bag, rarely used these days except for his own occasional injuries. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed. "Don't open it for anyone but me. My hunting rifle is loaded beside the bed." As Thomas stepped out into the blinding snow, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fragile piece of his solitary existence had shattered forever. Whatever storm had blown Catherine Winfield to his door was just beginning to show its true strength. And somewhere in the wilderness between his cabin and Silverton, men with cold eyes and false names were hunting them both. Blood dripped onto fresh snow, each scarlet drop a stark reminder of how quickly life could turn. Thomas pressed clean cloth against the young logger's mangled leg, his doctor's hands working with a confidence he thought he'd lost years ago. "Hold him steady," Thomas ordered the 2 men who'd brought the injured boy. The makeshift camp they'd set up barely offered protection from the biting wind. Billy Jenkins, the storekeeper's nephew, had been cutting trees when one snapped wrong, its massive weight pinning his leg against frozen ground. The other loggers had freed him and brought him partway down the mountain before sending a rider to fetch Thomas. "Will I lose it, Doc?" Billy asked through gritted teeth, his young face pale beneath dirt and sweat. Thomas didn't answer immediately, focusing on cleaning the wound. The leg wasn't crushed beyond saving, but infection posed the real danger. "Not if I can help it," he finally replied, reaching for his medical bag. Inside were precious bottles of alcohol and iodine, supplies he'd hoarded for years without using. "This will hurt badly." Billy nodded, biting down on a leather strap offered by one of the other men. As Thomas worked, his mind kept drifting back to his cabin, to Catherine waiting alone. What if Hawthorne's men returned? What if they'd circled back after he'd left? The worry made his hands less steady than they should be. "You still got the touch, Doc," said Mike Thornton, the oldest of the loggers. "Heard you gave up medicine." "I did," Thomas replied shortly, tying off a neat bandage around Billy's leg. "Lucky for the boy you didn't forget," Mike observed. "Lucky for a lot of folks if you ask me." Thomas didn't respond. Luck had nothing to do with it. Medical training lived in his muscles, in reflexes he couldn't erase no matter how many years he spent hiding in these mountains. "We need to get him to town," Thomas said, packing away his supplies. "The wound needs proper care." "Storm's coming in," said the third man, gesturing toward dark clouds gathering over the western peaks. "Won't make Silverton before it hits." Thomas weighed his options. Billy needed better care than he could provide in the wilderness. But Catherine was alone, possibly in danger. And if these men took him to town, Hawthorne's men might connect him to Catherine. "There's my cabin," Thomas said reluctantly. "About an hour from here. We can wait out the storm there, then get Billy to town tomorrow." Mike nodded gratefully. "Mighty kind," document. Kind wasn't the word Thomas would have chosen. Trapped felt more accurate. The men fashioned a stretcher from pine branches and blankets. As they lifted Billy, the boy cried out, then fell silent, passed out from pain. "Better that way," Mike said grimly. The journey back to the cabin took nearly 2 hours, the men struggling against strengthening wind and thickening snow. Thomas led the way, his thoughts racing ahead to Catherine. How would she react to strangers? Would she understand the necessity? When the cabin finally came into view through swirling snow, Thomas noticed immediately that no smoke rose from the chimney. Fear grabbed his chest. "Wait here," he told the men, hurrying ahead. The cabin door stood slightly open, knocked askew on its hinges. Thomas pushed it wide, heart hammering. "Catherine?" he called into the silent room. No answer came. The fire had died to embers. The blankets lay in a heap on the floor beside the bed. Catherine's clothes, her dress and coat, were gone from where he'd hung them to dry. On the table lay a single sheet of paper, held in place by his hunting knife. Thomas snatched it up, recognizing Catherine's handwriting. "Dr. Blackwood, they're coming back. Heard them talking as they rode away. I won't bring danger to your door after you saved my life. Don't follow me. Forget we met. K." Thomas crumpled the note in his fist. Stubborn, foolish woman. Where could she possibly go in this weather? On foot? The mountains would kill her before Hawthorne's men found her. "Doc," Mike called from outside. "Everything all right?" Thomas composed himself quickly. "Fine. Bring him in." He moved around the cabin, building the fire back up, clearing space for Billy on his bed. By the time the men carried the stretcher inside, the room had begun to warm. "Small place you got here," Mike commented, looking around curiously. "It's enough," Thomas replied, helping transfer Billy to the bed. The boy had regained consciousness, moaning softly as they moved him. Thomas checked the bandage. No fresh bleeding. A good sign. "Make yourselves comfortable," Thomas told the other men, gesturing to the chairs and floor. "Storm sounds like it's getting worse." While the men settled in, Thomas moved to the window, staring out at the white wilderness. Catherine had perhaps an hour's head start. In the snow, injured and weak from her ordeal. He needed to find her, but he couldn't leave Billy. "Something wrong, Doc?" Mike asked, joining him at the window. Thomas hesitated. These men were from Silverton. They might have seen Catherine, might even know about the strangers looking for her. "Did you notice anyone unusual in town recently?" Thomas asked carefully. "City folks asking questions?" Mike's weathered face creased in thought. "Come to mention it, yeah. 2 fancy gents at the hotel, claiming to be looking for a runaway girl, offering money for information." "What did you tell them?" "Nothing to tell," Mike shrugged. "Haven't seen any city women up this way." He studied Thomas's face. "Why? You expecting company?" Before Thomas could answer, the cabin door burst open. All 3 men reached for weapons, but it was only the 4th logger, who'd stayed outside with the horses. "Rider coming," he announced, snow dusting his shoulders. Moving fast through the trees. Thomas grabbed his rifle. "Stay with the boy," he ordered, following the logger outside. The storm had intensified, visibility reduced to mere yards. Thomas squinted against driving snow, raising his rifle as a dark shape emerged from the whiteness. Not Catherine. A man on horseback, dressed in furs against the cold. As he drew closer, Thomas recognized Jenkins, the storekeeper from Silverton. "Blackwood," Jenkins called, reining his horse to a stop. "Thank God I found you. What are you doing out in this storm?" Thomas demanded. Jenkins dismounted with difficulty, his round body not made for riding. "Had to warn you. Those men, the ones looking for the missing woman, they're not what they claim." Thomas lowered his rifle slightly. "What do you mean?" "After they talked to you, they came back to town, started drinking heavy at the saloon." Jenkins stomped snow from his boots. "One got loose-lipped, said they weren't looking to rescue any woman. They meant to silence her. Something about business in Chicago." Thomas's blood ran cold. "Come inside," he said, guiding Jenkins toward the cabin. Inside, the newcomer was greeted with surprise by the loggers. While Jenkins warmed himself by the fire, explaining how he'd followed the loggers' trail to find Thomas's mind raced. Catherine was out there alone, in a killer storm with killers hunting her. Any tracks she'd left would be covered by fresh snow within minutes. Which direction would she go? Not back toward Silverton, too obvious. The abandoned trapper's cabin Thomas had mentioned? Possibly. Billy groaned from the bed, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. The boy needed him too. How's he doing? Jenkins asked, nodding toward Billy. Stable for now, Thomas replied. But we need to get him to town when the storm breaks. That could be days, Mike said grimly. Weather like this, sometimes a week. Thomas made a decision. Jenkins, I need you to stay with Billy. Keep the wound clean, change the bandage every few hours. There's someone I need to find. In this storm. Mike looked at Thomas like he'd lost his mind. That's suicide document. Nevertheless, Thomas replied, moving to gather supplies. I'm going. Jenkins blocked his path. Doc, no one could survive out there long. If it's the woman those men are after, she's either found shelter or... He didn't finish the thought. Thomas pushed past him, stuffing bread, dried meat, and an extra blanket into a pack. There's a place she might have gone. I have to try. The other men exchanged looks, clearly thinking him crazy. Perhaps he was. 15 years of isolation had made him forget how to care about another person's fate. Now suddenly he cared too much. Mike stepped forward. I'll come with you. Thomas shook his head. Someone needs to get Billy to town when the weather clears. That's your job. Before anyone could argue further, Thomas donned his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and stepped back into the howling storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. Snow had already covered any tracks Catherine might have left. Thomas oriented himself by the rocky outcropping visible through the whiteness, then began trudging west. If Catherine had listened to anything he'd said earlier, she might have remembered him mentioning the abandoned trapper's cabin. 5 miles west, he'd told her. A hard walk even in good weather. Thomas bent his head against the driving snow and walked. Each step required effort, the snow now reaching mid-thigh in places. His face burned with cold despite the scarf. Night would fall soon. Finding the cabin in darkness would be nearly impossible. If Catherine was out in this without shelter, Thomas pushed the thought away. She was smart. She'd find a way to survive. A wolf howled somewhere to his left, the sound oddly comforting. Wolves were smart too. They didn't stay out in killing storms. As daylight faded, the storm intensified. Thomas could barely see 10 feet ahead. He should turn back, try again tomorrow. But tomorrow might be too late. Something dark loomed ahead, trees, thicker than those around his cabin. Thomas struggled toward them, knowing the old trapper's place lay just beyond the tree line. The physical effort of walking through deep snow had his heart pounding, sweat freezing on his skin beneath layers of clothing. Dangerous. Very dangerous. Just as Thomas began to fear he'd missed the cabin entirely, a faint orange glow caught his eye through the trees. Firelight. Someone was there. Thomas forced his burning legs to move faster, pushing through the last stretch of forest. The small cabin appeared like a mirage through the snow, a dark shape with one tiny window glowing with firelight. Hope surged through him, followed immediately by caution. What if it wasn't Catherine? What if Hawthorne's men had found this place too? Thomas approached slowly, drawing his pistol from beneath his coat. The small porch creaked under his weight as he reached the door. He listened. No voices, just the crackling of a fire. Holding his breath, Thomas pushed the door open. Catherine stood on the far side of the room, Thomas's hunting rifle aimed directly at his chest. Don't shoot, Thomas said, raising his hands slowly. It's just me. Catherine's face transformed from fierce determination to shock, then relief. She lowered the rifle, her hands visibly shaking. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. But the way her voice caught told a different story. Thomas closed the door against the howling wind and removed his snow-crusted outer layers. The cabin was smaller than his own. Just one room with a tiny pot-bellied stove, a rough-hewn table, and a single chair. No bed, just old furs piled in one corner. You shouldn't have left, he countered, moving to the fire's warmth. How did you even find this place? I remembered what you said. 5 miles west. Catherine set the rifle aside. I almost didn't make it. The storm came so quickly. Now that the immediate relief of finding her alive had passed, Thomas felt anger rising. You could have died out there. Why would you leave without waiting for me? I heard them read and the other man, as they rode away, Catherine explained, sinking onto the chair. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. They were planning to return with more men. Search your cabin. Couldn't let them find me there. Not after you helped me. Thomas softened slightly. How are you feeling? The fever. Better, she said, though her face remained too pale. Still weak. But walking through the snow woke me up quite effectively. Thomas noticed she had built a neat fire, arranged the sparse furnishings efficiently. You've managed well here. Father insisted his daughters learn practical skills, Catherine said with a hint of pride. He said wealth was no excuse for helplessness. The fire popped and hissed as snowmelt dripped from Thomas's clothes. Outside, the storm continued its assault, howling around the cabin's corners. We're trapped here until it passes, Thomas observed, unpacking the supplies he'd brought. Could be days. Catherine watched him quietly. You left a patient to come find me, didn't you? I saw the blood on the snow outside your cabin before I left. Thomas avoided her gaze. Billy Jenkins. Tree accident. He's stable enough. Dr. Blackwood? Catherine said softly. Why did you really come after me? The question hung in the air between them. Thomas busied himself arranging food on the table, searching for an answer that made sense even to himself. Doctor's duty, he finally said. Couldn't let my patient wander off to die in a blizzard. Catherine smiled faintly. Is that all? Before Thomas could answer, a sound outside made them both freeze, the distant whinny of a horse. Thomas moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the rough shutters. Nothing visible through the swirling snow. Could be wild horses, Catherine suggested without much conviction. This far up the mountain? In this weather? Thomas shook his head. Not likely. They stood in tense silence, listening. No further sounds came. Maybe I imagined, Catherine began, but Thomas raised a hand, cutting her off. There it was again, not a horse this time, but the crunch of snow under a heavy boot. Close to the cabin. Thomas grabbed the rifle, checking quickly that it was loaded. He motioned Catherine to move away from the window, against the wall where she couldn't be seen from outside. If anything happens to me, he whispered, there's a loose floorboard in the corner. Crawl space beneath. Hide there until the storm passes, then follow the stream east. It leads to the valley, eventually to town. Fear flashed in Catherine's eyes, but she nodded, moving silently to locate the floorboard he'd mentioned. Thomas positioned himself beside the door, rifle ready. Whoever was outside, they hadn't announced themselves, not a friendly visitor then. Minutes ticked by, measured by the pounding of Thomas's heart. Had the person gone? Or were they circling the cabin, looking for another entrance? A sharp rap on the door made them both jump. Hello inside, called a voice Thomas didn't recognize. Anyone there? Thomas and Catherine exchanged looks. Should he answer? Pretend no one was home? Saw the smoke, the voice continued. Just a traveler caught in the storm, looking for shelter. It might be innocent. A lost hunter, a prospector. The mountains held many solitary men who might be legitimately seeking refuge from the blizzard. Or it might be a trap. Thomas made a quick decision. Catherine, he whispered. Under the floorboard. Now. She hesitated only briefly before complying, lifting the loose board and slipping into the dark space beneath. Thomas replaced the board, then rumpled the furs in the corner to make it look like someone had been sleeping there. Coming, he called, adjusting his grip on the rifle. He took a deep breath, then pulled the door open. The man on the porch was not what Thomas expected. Elderly, perhaps 70, with a snow-covered beard and weathered face. He leaned heavily on a walking stick, his other arm cradling a small bundle wrapped in furs. Thank the Lord, the old man said, his voice cracking with relief. Thought I might die out there. Thomas lowered the rifle slightly, confused. Who are you? Name's Ezekiel Howard, the man replied, stamping snow from his boots. Most folks call me Zeke. I was checking my trap lines when the storm hit. Cabin's about 10 miles north, couldn't make it back. Thomas stepped aside reluctantly, allowing the old man to enter. "This isn't my cabin. I'm just waiting out the storm myself." Zeke shuffled to the fire, setting his bundle carefully on the table. "Don't much matter whose roof it is in weather like this. The good Lord provides." Thomas closed the door, keeping the rifle in hand. Something felt off about the old trapper, but he couldn't place what. "How did you find this place in the storm?" "Been trapping these mountains 40 years, son," Zeke replied, unwrapping his bundle. "Know every cabin, cave, and hollow between here and Canada." From the fur wrappings emerged a small fox kit, its red fur damp with snow, eyes bright with fear. "Found the little fella caught in one of my traps," Zeke explained, stroking the kit's head gently. "Mama fox nowhere to be seen. Couldn't leave him to die." Despite his suspicions, Thomas felt himself warming to the old man. Few trappers would bother saving a fox kit. Most would see it as one less predator to compete with for catches. "You have supplies?" Thomas asked, finally setting the rifle aside. "Some jerky, bit of coffee if you've got a pot," Zeke replied. "Nothing fancy." Thomas found an old pot hanging near the stove and filled it with snow to melt. As he worked, he kept one eye on the old man, who seemed content to warm himself and tend to the small fox. "You expecting trouble?" Zeke asked suddenly, nodding toward the rifle. "Mountains can be dangerous," Thomas replied vaguely. Zeke chuckled. "True enough, especially these days with city folks coming up here who don't belong." Thomas tensed. "What do you mean?" "Saw a pair of them in Silverton last week," Zeke continued casually. "Fancy clothes, asking about a woman, offering money for information." He looked up, his eyes suddenly sharp beneath bushy brows. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Dr. Blackwood?" Thomas froze. He hadn't told the old man his name. In one fluid motion that belied his apparent age, Zeke pulled a revolver from beneath his coat and aimed it squarely at Thomas's chest. "Now then," he said, his voice no longer feeble, "why don't you tell your lady friend to come out from her hiding place, and we can all have a proper conversation?" Thomas's mind raced. How had the old man known? Had he been watching the cabin? Following them? "There's no one else here," Thomas tried, though he knew the lie was pointless now. Zeke sighed. "Please don't insult my intelligence, Doctor. I tracked you both here through the storm. Quite impressive that the lady made it this far in her condition. Now, shall I start shooting up the floorboards, or will you call her out?" Before Thomas could respond, the loose board lifted and Catherine emerged, dignity intact despite the dust clinging to her dress. "You have me at a disadvantage, sir," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "You know who we are, but your introduction was clearly fiction." The old man smiled, dropping the mountain accent entirely. "Marshal Robert Cooper, Miss Winfield, federal agent. I've been investigating James Hawthorne for 6 months." Thomas and Catherine exchanged stunned glances. "Federal agent?" Thomas repeated. "You're not working for Hawthorne?" Cooper lowered his gun, tucking it back into his coat. "Quite the opposite. Hawthorne's steel mills have government contracts to supply the railroads. When reports of substandard materials and unsafe practices reached Washington, I was sent to investigate." Catherine stepped forward eagerly. "Then you know what he's done." "I suspect a great deal, Miss Winfield, but suspicion isn't proof." Cooper reached into his coat and withdrew a badge, which he placed on the table. "Your father had contacted federal authorities shortly before his death. He was preparing to provide evidence. Evidence that disappeared from his safe," Catherine said bitterly. Cooper nodded. "Which is why finding you became extremely important. Hawthorne's men have been searching for you quite frantically, suggesting you either have something he wants or know something he fears." Thomas moved to stand beside Catherine, suddenly protective. "How do we know you're really who you claim to be? That badge could be fake." "A fair question," Cooper conceded, "and I have no definitive way to prove it to you here. But consider this, if I meant you harm, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Catherine touched Thomas's arm gently. "He's right. Hawthorne's men wouldn't bother with this charade. Thomas wasn't entirely convinced, but Catherine's trust swayed him. "What do you want from us?" "Your help," Cooper replied simply. "Miss Winfield, your father told my department that he'd documented evidence of Hawthorne's crimes, not just industrial sabotage, but potentially murder. Do you know where this documentation might be?" Catherine shook her head. "If it was in his safe, it's gone now. Hawthorne's men searched the house thoroughly after Father's death." "Your father was an intelligent man," Cooper pressed. "He would have anticipated Hawthorne might find the safe. Was there anywhere else he might have hidden something important? Something perhaps only family would know about?" Catherine paced the small cabin, thinking. Father had hiding places throughout the house, but Hawthorne knew about most of them. They'd worked together for years. What about places outside the house? Thomas suggested. "A bank vault? Family property." Catherine stopped suddenly, her eyes widening. "The summer house, Lake Geneva. We haven't opened it since Mother died 8 years ago. Father kept it exactly as it was when she was alive." "Would Hawthorne know about it?" Cooper asked. "Of course, but he'd have no reason to search there. It's been closed up for years, and Father never kept business documents there. It was Mother's special place." Cooper nodded thoughtfully. "It's worth investigating, but getting you safely to Wisconsin is the challenge now. Hawthorne has men watching the trains, the roads. And we're trapped here until this storm passes anyway," Thomas pointed out, gesturing to the window where snow still swirled violently. "Perhaps that's fortunate," Cooper said. "Gives us time to plan. Hawthorne's men won't be able to track us in this weather either." The three fell silent, each lost in thought. The small fox Kit had curled up by the stove, apparently deciding these strange humans posed no immediate threat. Thomas studied Catherine's face in the firelight. She looked exhausted but determined, her spirit unbroken despite everything she'd endured. In just days, his quiet, isolated life had been completely upended by her arrival. Yet somehow he couldn't bring himself to regret it. "You still haven't explained how you found us," Thomas said to Cooper. The federal agent smiled slightly. "I've been in Silverton for weeks, posing as a prospector. When Hawthorne's men arrived asking about a woman, I paid attention. Then when they started asking specifically about a hermit doctor in the mountains, I knew something significant was happening." "You followed them to my cabin," Thomas guessed. "And then followed you here through the storm," Cooper confirmed. "Not an easy task, I might add." Catherine sat down heavily on the chair, the events of the day clearly taking their toll. "So what happens now? We wait out the storm. Then what?" "Hawthorne's men are still out there." Cooper's expression grew serious. "First, Miss Winfield, I need to know exactly what your father told you before he died. Every detail could be important." As Catherine began recounting her final conversations with her father, Thomas moved to check on the fox Kit. The small creature had fallen asleep, its tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. Just like this fox, Thomas thought, Catherine had stumbled into his path injured and vulnerable. And just like the fox, she had awoken something in him he thought long dead, a desire to protect, to care, to engage with the world beyond his solitary existence. Outside, the storm continued to rage, temporarily holding the dangers of Hawthorne's men at bay. But Thomas knew the real storm, the one that would determine whether Catherine found justice for her father, was just beginning to gather strength. And somehow, against all his careful plans for a life of isolation, he had placed himself directly in its path. "Catherine Winfield doesn't exist anymore," Marshal Cooper announced, spreading documents across the rough wooden table. Dawn light filtered through the cabin's single window, revealing a world transformed by the blizzard. 3 feet of fresh snow blanketed everything outside, pristine and deadly in its beauty. Catherine leaned forward, examining the papers with furrowed brows. "Margaret Bennett?" she read aloud from one document. "Who is she?" "You are," Cooper replied, tapping a freshly created identification card bearing Catherine's likeness but a stranger's name. "A widow traveling west to meet her uncle in San Francisco." Thomas watched from across the cabin, mixing a healing poultice from herbs he'd found in the trapper's stores. The storm had finally broken during the night, leaving them with decisions to make. Cooper's plan was bold, perhaps even foolhardy. "And what about Dr. Blackwood?" Catherine asked, glancing toward Thomas. Cooper smiled slightly. "He'll be John Bennett, your protective older brother, escorting you west after your husband's tragic passing." Thomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Brother and sister? The cover might work at a distance, but anyone paying close attention would notice how Thomas looked at Catherine when she wasn't watching. Nothing brotherly in that gaze. "We leave at noon," Cooper continued, gathering the papers. "The passes should be clear enough by then. We'll head north first, then east toward the Great Northern Line. Hawthorne's men will be watching the Silverton station." "What about Billy?" Thomas asked. "The injured boy at my cabin." "Your logger friends would have taken him to town once the weather cleared," Cooper replied. "I'll send a telegram from the first station we reach. Make sure he's being cared for properly." Catherine stood, stretching stiff muscles. 3 days in the cramped cabin had taken their toll on all of them. "I need some air," she announced, reaching for her coat. "Stay close," Cooper warned. "We don't know who might be searching once the storm's passed." Outside, Catherine breathed deeply of the crisp mountain air. The world glittered around her, silent and majestic. She'd never seen such perfect stillness, such complete isolation from the noise and smoke of Chicago. Thomas joined her a moment later, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "Your breakfast," he explained, handing it to her. "Such as it is." Catherine accepted the dried meat and hard biscuit gratefully. "Thank you for this and everything." Thomas gazed out at the snow-covered landscape, his face unreadable. "Your father knew I was here all along, didn't he? That's why he told you to find the mountain doctor when he suspected Hawthorne was trying to kill him." Catherine nodded slowly. "He kept track of you over the years. Said you were the finest doctor he'd ever known, and that someday you'd remember that too." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He gave me too much credit." "I don't think so," Catherine said softly. "You saved my life in that snowstorm. You're risking everything to help me now." Before Thomas could respond, Cooper emerged from the cabin, his pack already slung over his shoulder. "We need to move," he said urgently. "Saw smoke to the south. Someone's coming up the mountain." The peaceful moment shattered. Thomas hurried back inside, gathering their few belongings while Catherine quickly finished her meager breakfast. Within minutes, they were trudging through deep snow, Cooper leading the way with sure-footed confidence. The fox kit, which had become something of a mascot during their cabin confinement, rode in Cooper's pocket, its bright eyes taking in the white world. "How far to the northern pass?" Thomas asked, helping Catherine over a fallen log buried beneath snow. 10 miles, Cooper replied. "Hard going in these conditions. We'll need to reach the trading post by nightfall." Catherine stumbled slightly, still weak from her ordeal. Thomas's hand steadied her immediately, strong and certain. She found herself leaning into his support more than strictly necessary. "You're doing fine," he murmured encouragingly. "Just a little farther." By midday, the sun burned away some of the snow, making their passage easier but also more visible to anyone following. Cooper led them through dense stands of pine where possible, avoiding open meadows. The fox kit occasionally poked its head from Cooper's pocket, sniffing the air curiously. As they crested a ridge, Cooper suddenly dropped to a crouch, signaling the others to do the same. Below them, perhaps a mile distant, 3 riders moved across a snow-covered meadow. "Hawthorne's men," Catherine whispered. Cooper studied the distant figures through a small spyglass. "Can't be sure, but they're heading toward your cabin, Thomas." Thomas frowned. "How would they know to look there?" "Perhaps they don't," Cooper replied, tucking away the spyglass. "Could be checking every shelter in the area. Either way, we need to pick up our pace." The next hours passed in grim determination, each step taking them farther from Thomas's mountain sanctuary and closer to the uncertain future that awaited them. Catherine felt guilt weighing on her shoulders with every mile. She had brought this danger into Thomas's peaceful existence. He had built a life away from the world's complications, and she had dragged him back into them. Late afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow when Cooper finally called a halt beside a frozen stream. "Need to rest briefly," he explained, looking particularly at Catherine. "The trading post is just beyond those trees. We'll reach it by dusk." Catherine sank gratefully onto a fallen log, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Thomas knelt beside her, checking her pulse with professional detachment. Only his eyes betrayed his concern. "Your fever's returning," he said quietly. "We need to get you someplace warm soon." Cooper scanned their back trail, face tense. "Something's not right," he muttered. "We've made good time, but what is it?" Thomas asked, rising to stand beside him. "No pursuit," Cooper said. "If those riders were Hawthorne's men and they found signs we'd been at the cabin, they should be on our trail by now." "Maybe they didn't find anything," Catherine suggested hopefully. Cooper shook his head. 3 days in that cabin, impossible not to leave traces. "No, something else is happening." A distant sound made them all freeze, the jingling of harness bells, coming from the direction of the trading post ahead. Cooper drew his pistol. "Stay here. I'll scout ahead." Before he could move, however, the source of the sound appeared through the trees. A large sleigh pulled by 4 horses, moving steadily along a trail that intersected their path. The driver, bundled against the cold, didn't notice them half hidden among the pines. "Perfect timing," Cooper murmured, a smile spreading across his weathered face. "Our transportation has arrived." "You arranged this?" Thomas asked, surprised. Cooper's smile widened. "Let's just say I planned for contingencies. Come on." They hurried through the snow toward the trail. Cooper stepped out first, waving his arms to catch the driver's attention. The sleigh slowed, then stopped. "Ho there, Fergus," Cooper called cheerfully. "Room for 3 more to the station?" The driver, a burly man with a magnificent beard frosted with ice, squinted at them suspiciously. Then recognition dawned. "Cooper, didn't expect to see you out here after that storm." "Change of plans," Cooper replied easily. "These good folks need passage east. Urgent family matter." Fergus eyed Thomas and Catherine dubiously, noting her city clothes and obvious exhaustion. "Ain't much room with all this mail, but you can squeeze in the back. $20 to the station." Cooper handed over the money without haggling, then helped Catherine climb aboard. The sleigh's bed was indeed packed with mailbags and parcels, leaving only a small space where they could huddle together. As the sleigh lurched forward, resuming its journey, Catherine found herself pressed close against Thomas's side. His arm went around her shoulders automatically, steadying her against the jolting motion. "Rest now," he said softly. "You're safe." Catherine wasn't certain that was true, but her body betrayed her regardless, eyelids growing heavy as the rhythm of the sleigh and the warmth of Thomas beside her lulled her toward sleep. Thomas watched her drift off, concern etching lines around his eyes. Her skin felt too warm against his hand when he brushed a strand of hair from her face. The fever was definitely returning. "She needs a doctor," he murmured to Cooper. The marshal smiled faintly. "She has one." Thomas shook his head. "I haven't practiced real medicine in 15 years. And yet you saved the Jenkins boy's leg, and you saved Miss Winfield from freezing to death," Cooper observed. "Seems to me being a doctor isn't something you forget, no matter how long you hide from it." Thomas had no response to that. Instead, he gazed at the passing landscape, the mountains he'd called home gradually giving way to gentler foothills as they descended toward civilization. Each mile carried him further from the safety of isolation, back toward a world filled with pain and loss and failure. And yet, with Catherine's head resting trustingly against his shoulder, Thomas couldn't bring himself to regret the journey. The sky darkened to deep twilight as the sleigh rounded a final bend, revealing a cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and lanterns glowed warmly in windows. The trading post was larger than Thomas had expected, almost a small town in its own right. Northern Pacific Station's just beyond, Fergus called back to them. Train should be through by morning. Cooper nodded his thanks, then gently shook Catherine awake as the sleigh slowed near a 2-story building with a sign proclaiming it Taylor's Mercantile and Inn. We'll need rooms for the night, Cooper told them quietly. Remember your new identities. John and Margaret Bennett, brother and sister. I'm your uncle's friend, helping you make the journey. Catherine blinked sleepily, then nodded, her training in proper society making the adoption of a new role almost second nature. Thomas looked less comfortable with the deception but nodded his agreement. As the sleigh came to a stop, Cooper jumped down first, then helped Catherine while Thomas gathered their meager belongings. The trading post bustled with activity, despite the late hour. Trappers, traders, and travelers moving between buildings, their breath clouding in the cold air. Strange place, Thomas muttered, eyeing the crowd warily. After so many years of solitude, even this small gathering of humanity felt overwhelming. Stay close, Cooper advised, guiding them toward the inn's entrance. And remember, we're just ordinary travelers passing through. As they approached the door, it swung open suddenly, spilling golden lamplight onto the snow. A man stepped out, his face hidden in shadow against the brightness behind him. When he moved into the light, Thomas felt Catherine stiffen beside him. The man was tall, expensively dressed despite the frontier setting, with a neatly trimmed beard and cold eyes that swept calculatingly over the new arrivals. His gaze lingered on Catherine just long enough to raise the hairs on Thomas's neck. "Excuse me," the man said politely, stepping aside to let them pass. His voice carried the refined accent of Eastern wealth and education. Cooper nodded curtly, ushering Thomas and Catherine inside. As the door closed behind them, Thomas leaned close to Catherine's ear. "You recognized him," he whispered. Catherine's face had gone pale beneath her fever flush. "James Hawthorne," she breathed, the name barely audible. That was James Hawthorne. Voices drifted through the thin walls of the inn, meaningless murmurs that failed to mask the sounds of creaking floorboards outside their door. Someone was pacing the hallway, waiting, listening. James Hawthorne hadn't recognized Catherine. Or if he had, he'd given no sign. Cooper had moved them swiftly through the inn's common room to secure 2 adjacent chambers before Hawthorne could get a proper look at their faces. Now, hours later, Thomas sat in a straight-back chair beside Catherine's bed, watching her restless sleep as the fever dreams took hold. A soft knock at the connecting door prompted Thomas to rise, gun in hand. "Yes, it's Cooper," came the quiet reply. Thomas unlocked the door, admitting the federal agent. Cooper's expression was grim as he glanced toward Catherine's flushed face. "How is she?" "Fever's climbing," Thomas replied. "I need medicines, proper supplies." Cooper nodded. "I'll arrange it, but we have bigger problems. I've been making discreet inquiries. Hawthorne's not alone. He has at least 4 men with him, and they're watching the train station." Thomas ran a hand through his beard. "How did he find us? How could he possibly know we'd come this way?" "I don't think he did," Cooper said thoughtfully. "I believe he's covering all possible routes east. The man's resources are considerable. What do we do now?" Cooper moved to the window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. "There's a freight train coming through tomorrow afternoon. Not for passengers, but I know the conductor. He might be persuaded to take on 3 extra bodies heading east." Catherine stirred on the bed, murmuring something unintelligible. Thomas returned to her side immediately, laying a cool cloth across her forehead. "She can't travel like this," he said firmly. "The fever needs to break first." Cooper's jaw tightened. "We may not have that luxury. If Hawthorne recognizes her, then we'll deal with that problem when it arises," Thomas interrupted. "I've watched patients die from fevers like this. I won't risk her life by moving her too soon." The 2 men stared at each other, a silent battle of wills that ended when Cooper finally nodded. "One day, if the fever breaks by tomorrow night, we take the midnight freight." After Cooper left, Thomas sat again in the uncomfortable chair, his mind working through the limited options available to them. They needed allies, information, resources, all things he'd deliberately abandoned 15 years ago. A soft whimper from Catherine drew his attention. Her eyes had opened, bright with fever but surprisingly lucid. "He'll kill you too," she whispered. "Hawthorne, if he finds us, you should go while you can." Thomas smiled gently. "And leave you here alone? What kind of brother would that make me?" Catherine's laugh turned into a cough. "Not my brother," she managed. "Not how I think of you." Thomas felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the room's small fire. "You should rest," he said, avoiding the implied question in her words. "Tell me about your wife," Catherine said instead, surprising him. "What was her name?" Thomas hesitated, the old pain rising like bile in his throat. No one had asked him about Sarah in years. No one had dared. "Sarah," he finally said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long. "Her name was Sarah, and our daughter was Elizabeth." Catherine reached out, her fever-hot fingers finding his hand. "What happened? Really?" Thomas stared at their joined hands, wondering why the simple question didn't send him running for the door. Perhaps because Catherine had faced her own losses, her own grief. "Scarlet fever," he said softly. "I was the best doctor in Chicago," they said, "called to attend the finest families. But when it struck my own home," he swallowed hard, "couldn't save them. I tried everything. Every treatment, every experimental technique. Nothing worked." "So you ran away," Catherine said, not unkindly. "Hid in the mountains." "I couldn't face it," Thomas admitted. "The pity, the whispers. Poor Dr. Blackwood couldn't even save his own family. Every patient I saw afterward, I saw their faces. Every child with a fever became Elizabeth in my mind." Catherine's grip tightened on his hand. "You didn't fail them, Thomas. Medicine has limits. Even the best doctors lose patients." "Not their own wife and child," Thomas said bitterly. "Especially their own," Catherine countered. "Because then it's not medicine anymore. It's love and fear and desperate hope. Those cloud judgment, make the steadiest hands shake." Thomas looked at her in wonder. How could this woman he'd known for mere days see so clearly what he'd blinded himself to for 15 years? "Sleep now," he said gently, unable to respond to her insight. "You need rest to fight this fever." Catherine's eyes drifted closed, but her hand remained firmly in his. "Don't leave," she murmured. "I won't," Thomas promised. Morning brought new challenges. Catherine's fever had broken sometime during the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. Thomas had dozed in the chair beside her bed, waking at the first light of dawn to find Cooper already in the room, pacing anxiously. "Hawthorne's men are searching the inn," he reported without preamble. "Room by room. They claim to be looking for a fugitive embezzler, but we know who they're really after." Thomas rose quickly. "How much time do we have?" "Minutes at most. They're starting at the other end of the hall." Catherine struggled to sit up, her face pale but determined. "We need to leave. Now." "No time to reach the station," Cooper said, peering out the window. "And they'll have men watching the roads." Thomas moved to the window beside Cooper. The inn faced the main street of the trading post, but the back overlooked a stable yard and, beyond that, dense pine forest. Two men in city clothes stood smoking by the stable doors, their casual posture belied by the way their eyes constantly scanned the surroundings. "The roof," Thomas said suddenly, pointing up. "There's a dormer window above us. If we can reach the attic, we might be able to cross to the mercantile next door." Cooper nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. I'll check the hallway." While Cooper slipped out to scout, Thomas helped Catherine dress. Her hands shook slightly as she buttoned her coat, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I'm sorry I've brought this trouble to you," she said quietly. Thomas shook his head. "You didn't bring it. Hawthorne did. And perhaps I've been hiding too long anyway." Cooper returned, closing the door softly behind him. "Hallway's clear for the moment, but there's a staircase to the attic at the end. We'll need to move quickly and quietly." They gathered their few belongings, then followed Cooper into the dimly lit hallway. Voices drifted up from below, guests complaining about the early morning disturbance as Hawthorne's men conducted their search. The trio moved silently toward the narrow stairs Cooper had found, hidden behind an unobtrusive door at the hall's end. The attic was dusty and cobwebbed, filled with discarded furniture and trunks of forgotten belongings. Light filtered through small windows at either end of the long space. Cooper led them carefully between stacked chairs and boxes toward the window that would give them access to the roof. "Careful now," he whispered as he eased the window open. Cold morning air rushed in, carrying the smell of wood smoke and pine. The slope is steep, but there's a flat section where the mercantile's roof connects. Cooper went first, demonstrating surprising agility for a man his age as he swung out onto the frost-covered shingles. Thomas helped Catherine through next, his heart in his throat as she navigated the treacherous slope. He followed last, easing the window closed behind them to hide their escape route. The rooftop was perilous, slick with morning frost and steeply pitched. They edged along slowly, keeping low and close to the warm brick of the chimney where the frost had melted somewhat. Below, unaware of the drama unfolding above their heads, the trading post was coming to life, shopkeepers opening their doors, travelers heading for early-stage departures. They had almost reached the mercantile's adjoining roof when a shout came from below. "Up there! On the roof!" Thomas looked down to see one of Hawthorne's men pointing directly at them, shouting to his companions. Their cover was blown. "Run!" Cooper ordered, abandoning caution for speed. They scrambled across the remaining distance, Catherine slipping once and nearly sliding off the edge before Thomas caught her arm. The mercantile's roof was indeed flatter, allowing them to move more quickly. Cooper led them toward the back of the building, where a stack of empty crates created a makeshift ladder to the ground. The sound of breaking glass made them all turn. Hawthorne himself was climbing through an upstairs window of the inn, stepping onto the roof they'd just traversed. His face was a mask of cold determination as he carefully picked his way toward them. "Go!" Thomas urged Catherine toward the crates. "I'll hold them off." "Not alone you won't," Cooper growled, drawing his pistol. Catherine hesitated, but one look at the men's determined faces sent her scrambling down the crate stack. Thomas and Cooper positioned themselves at the roof edge, prepared to delay Hawthorne and his men as long as possible. "Federal agent," Cooper shouted, aiming his weapon at Hawthorne. "Stop where you are." Hawthorne paused, a smile spreading across his handsome face. "Federal agent? How convenient. I don't suppose you have identification." Hiding on rooftops and aiding fugitives, Cooper stood his ground. "James Hawthorne, you're under investigation for fraud, industrial sabotage, and the murder of Edward Winfield." "Serious charges," Hawthorne replied calmly, "and completely baseless, as you'll discover if you survive long enough to file a report." He gestured subtly, and Thomas noticed movement from the corners of the rooftop, more of Hawthorne's men, emerging from hidden positions. They were surrounded. Thomas glanced down to see Catherine had reached the ground and was looking up at them, horror dawning on her face as she realized their predicament. "Run!" he shouted to her. "Find Jenkins at the station. Tell him everything." For one agonizing moment, Catherine seemed frozen in indecision. Then she turned and fled toward the trees, her blue dress disappearing quickly among the pines. Hawthorne sighed dramatically. How gallant, and utterly pointless. He addressed his men without taking his eyes off Thomas and Cooper. "Two of you go after the woman. The rest, take these gentlemen someplace private where we can have a proper conversation." "That's not happening," Cooper replied, his pistol steady. "Thomas, when I fire, jump." Thomas didn't question the instruction. When Cooper's shot rang out, hitting the chimney above Hawthorne's head and sending brick fragments flying, Thomas leaped from the roof toward the crate stack. His weight smashed through the weathered wood, sending him tumbling painfully to the ground. Cooper landed beside him a moment later with a grunt of pain. "Go!" Cooper gasped, clutching his ankle. "I've twisted something." "Find Catherine." Thomas hesitated, unwilling to leave the injured man. "That's an order," Cooper barked. "She's the only one who can prove what Hawthorne did. Go!" Shots from the rooftop spurred Thomas into action. He sprinted toward the trees, bullets kicking up dirt at his heels. Behind him, he heard Cooper returning fire, covering his escape. The forest closed around Thomas like an old friend, the familiar embrace of pine and shadow. He ran without looking back, following Catherine's tracks in the light dusting of snow that remained on the forest floor. 15 years in the mountains had made him an excellent tracker, but Catherine's trail was easy to follow. City shoes left distinct impressions, her hurried flight breaking branches and disturbing undergrowth. The sound of pursuit drove him forward. Heavy footsteps and harsh breathing told him Hawthorne's men were not far behind. Thomas veered suddenly east, away from Catherine's trail, hoping to draw the pursuers after him instead. The gambit worked. The footsteps followed his new direction, allowing Catherine to escape unhindered, if she could find her way to the station alone. Thomas ran until his lungs burned, old muscles protesting the sudden exertion. When he could run no more, he ducked behind a massive fallen tree, pressing himself against the damp bark as his pursuers crashed past. "Where'd he go?" one man gasped, scanning the forest. "Keep moving," another replied. "He's heading for the station. We'll cut him off." The men continued east, following the false trail Thomas had laid. When their sounds faded, Thomas doubled back, circling toward the trading post from a different direction. He needed to reach the station before Hawthorne realized they'd been tricked. The forest thinned as he approached the northern edge of the settlement. Through the trees, Thomas could see the railroad tracks and the small wooden platform that served as Hilltop Station. A thin plume of smoke in the distance announced an approaching train. Thomas moved cautiously from tree to tree, searching for any sign of Catherine or Hawthorne's men. The station appeared empty except for a single figure seated on a bench, an elderly woman with a large carpetbag beside her. No Catherine. Had she reached the station? Been captured? Thomas hesitated at the forest edge, uncertain. A hand touched his shoulder from behind. Thomas whirled, fists raised, only to find Catherine standing there, a finger to her lips. Relief flooded through him. "How did you?" he began, but she cut him off with a quick shake of her head. "Jenkins," she whispered. "He's hiding us in the freight car. But we have to hurry. Train's almost here." "Cooper?" Thomas asked urgently. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "They took him. I saw from the trees. Hawthorne's men dragged him into a building at the edge of town." Thomas closed his eyes briefly, a silent apology to the federal agent who had risked everything to help them. "We'll send help from the next town," he promised. "But now we need to move." Catherine led him along the tree line until they reached a small shed near the tracks. A middle-aged man with a railroad uniform and thick mustache waited anxiously by the door. "Jenkins?" Thomas asked. The man nodded. "Miss Winfield explained your situation. Any friend of Cooper's is a friend of mine." He checked his pocket watch. "Train's due in 5 minutes. You'll be in the last car, freight and mail. It's not comfortable, but it'll get you to Granville by nightfall. That's a bigger station. More places to hide. More trains heading east." "Thank you," Catherine said fervently. Jenkins waved away her thanks. "Just doing what's right. Cooper's saved my bacon more times than I can count." He peered around the shed's corner. "Coast is clear for now, but Hawthorne's got men watching the passenger platform. We'll need to board you from the far side when the train stops for water." A distant whistle announced the train's approach. Thomas felt Catherine's hand slip into his, her fingers cold but steady. Without thinking, he raised her hand to his lips, pressing a quick kiss to her knuckles. "We'll make it," he promised quietly. "Together." The warmth that flooded Catherine's eyes made Thomas's heart skip a beat. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, something new and unexpected was blooming between them. Something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. The train's rumbling approach grew louder, steel wheels on steel rails announcing either their escape or the beginning of an even more dangerous journey. Steam billowed around them as the massive train groaned to a stop, its iron wheels screeching against the rails. Thomas gripped Catherine's hand tightly, Both of them crouched behind stacked lumber near the water tower. Jenkins, the railroad man, signaled them with a quick wave from the far side of the tracks. "Now!" Jenkins hissed as he pretended to inspect the wheels of the last car. "Quick and quiet." Thomas helped Catherine scramble across the tracks, his eyes constantly scanning for Hawthorne's men. The freight car door slid open just enough for them to slip inside. Within seconds, they were enveloped in darkness that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and mail sacks. "Stay low," Jenkins whispered, sliding the door nearly closed. "Don't make a sound until we're well away from the station." The train whistle blew, loud and urgent. A jolt ran through the car as the engine strained against the weight of its load. Catherine stumbled into Thomas, who steadied her with an arm around her waist. Through the narrow opening in the door, they watched Jenkins give them a final nod before turning away. The station began to slide past as the train picked up speed, first inches at a time, then feet, then yards. Thomas held his breath, waiting for shouts of discovery, for Hawthorne's men to come running. None came. As the trading post fell away behind them, Catherine sagged against him in relief. "We made it," she breathed. "For now," Thomas cautioned, helping her sit on a sturdy crate. "Hawthorne won't give up so easily." The freight car's interior came into focus as their eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through cracks in the wooden walls. Mail sacks were stacked along one side, various crates and parcels secured with ropes on the other. At the far end, a small pot-bellied stove provided minimal heat, currently unlit. "What about Cooper?" Catherine asked, her voice tight with worry. "We can't just leave him." Thomas lit a small lantern hanging near the stove, its gentle glow revealing the concern etched on his face. "First chance we get, we'll telegraph the federal authorities. Cooper has colleagues who can help him." "If he's still alive," Catherine said softly. Thomas couldn't offer false reassurances. They both knew what Hawthorne was capable of. Instead, he busied himself lighting the stove and taking stock of their provisions. A canteen of water and some beef jerky Jenkins had slipped them before boarding. The rhythmic clacking of wheels against rails filled the silence as the train picked up speed. Mountains rolled past the half-open door, gradual foothills giving way to valleys and plains as they headed east. "What happens when we reach Granville?" Catherine asked, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. Thomas stared out at the passing landscape. "We find another train heading east. Make our way to your family's summer house in Lake Geneva. Find your father's evidence. And then, justice," Thomas said simply. "For your father. For Cooper." Catherine studied him in the lantern light. This man who had been a stranger mere days ago. The hermit doctor who had saved her life and was now risking his own to help her. The broken man who was finding his strength again, piece by piece. "Why are you really doing this, Thomas?" she asked quietly. "You could have stayed in your cabin. Could have sent me on my way once I was well enough." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames visible through the stove's tiny window. "Maybe I've been hiding long enough," he finally said. 15 years in those mountains, punishing myself for failures I couldn't control. And now, a ghost of a smile crossed his face. Now I have the chance to help someone, to make a difference again. I'd forgotten how that feels. The train rounded a bend, sunlight streaming through the door in golden shafts that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Catherine moved to sit beside Thomas, their shoulders touching. "My father would have liked you," she said softly. "I wish I could have known him better," Thomas replied. "He sounds like a good man. The best." Catherine's voice caught. "He believed people deserved better than what the world gave them. Better working conditions, safer factories, fair wages. Hawthorne called him a dreamer, said his ideas would bankrupt the company. Men like Hawthorne never understand that treating people well isn't charity. It's good business," Thomas observed. "Healthy workers who aren't afraid of dying in accidents work better, stay longer." Catherine smiled. "That's exactly what Father used to say." Her smile faded. "I miss him so much." Thomas hesitated, then put his arm around her shoulders. Catherine leaned into him, accepting the comfort he offered. They sat that way as miles rolled beneath them, each lost in thoughts of those they'd loved and lost. James Hawthorne was not a man accustomed to failure. Sitting in the private office he'd commandeered at the Trading Post's small hotel, he tapped manicured fingers against polished mahogany, his face a mask of controlled rage. "How?" he asked with deadly quiet. "Did they escape you?" The three men standing before him exchanged nervous glances, none eager to answer. "Sir," the boldest finally ventured, "they had help. Someone at the station." "I'm not interested in excuses," Hawthorne cut him off. "I'm interested in results. Catherine Winfield and her doctor friend are on that train, heading east with information that could destroy everything I've built." He stood, straightening his immaculate suit. "Where is our guest?" "In the storeroom, as you ordered," answered the shortest man, a former Pinkerton detective named Reed. "He's not talking yet." Hawthorne smiled coldly. "Everyone talks eventually, Mr. Reed. It's simply a matter of finding the right persuasion." He moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the knob. "Send telegrams to our contacts in Granville, Miles City, and Fargo. Every station eastward. $5,000 to whoever stops Winfield and the doctor." "And Mr. Reed?" "Yes, sir. Remind our men that discretion is essential. This must look like unfortunate accidents. Nothing that would draw attention from authorities." Reed nodded, understanding perfectly. "Of course, sir." Hawthorne descended the narrow stairs to the hotel's cellar, a place that smelled of damp earth and forgotten vegetables. At the far end, a heavy door led to a storeroom currently serving a purpose its builders never intended. Marshal Cooper looked up as Hawthorne entered, his weathered face showing bruises but no fear. He sat tied to a chair, his federal badge placed mockingly on a crate before him. "Mr. Hawthorne," Cooper greeted him calmly, "I was wondering when you'd join us. Your men ask very boring questions." Hawthorne chuckled, genuinely amused. "Marshal Cooper, a federal agent investigating me for months, and I never suspected. I must commend your acting skills." "I take a bow, but I'm a bit tied up at the moment," Cooper replied dryly. "Always joking," Hawthorne observed, circling the bound man. "A common trait among men who believe they hold moral high ground. But morality is a luxury, Marshal Cooper. Business is about survival. Is that how you justify murder? Industrial sabotage? Calling it survival?" Hawthorne stopped his pacing. "Edward Winfield was going to destroy everything we built together. His so-called safety improvements would have cost millions to implement across all our mills. Millions we didn't have. So you killed him," Cooper said flatly. "I protected our company," Hawthorne corrected. "The company that employs thousands, that builds America's railroads and bridges. Winfield lost sight of that larger purpose." Cooper shook his head in disgust. "And Catherine? What threat does she pose?" "Her father told her too much," Hawthorne said simply. "And now she's carrying that dangerous knowledge east. But she won't get far. My men will find her." "You might be surprised," Cooper replied with a slight smile. "Catherine Winfield has proven remarkably resilient. And Dr. Blackwood is not a man to underestimate." Hawthorne's expression hardened. "Everyone has limits, Marshal. Even the good doctor." He turned to leave, but Cooper's voice stopped him at the door. "You know what your mistake was, Hawthorne? Thinking this is just about Catherine Winfield. But it's bigger than her now." Hawthorne looked back, one eyebrow raised. "Oh," Cooper's smile widened. "Federal investigations don't die with one agent. My reports are already filed. My superiors know everything about your operations. Even if you silence me, they'll send others." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Hawthorne's face. He recovered quickly, his customary confidence returning. "Then I'll just have to deal with them too," he said smoothly, closing the door behind him. Alone again, Cooper tested his bonds for the 100th time. The ropes held firm, but one of the chair's legs wobbled slightly. He smiled to himself in the darkness. Hawthorne's mistake wasn't underestimating Catherine or Thomas. It was underestimating him. Night had fallen by the time the train approached Granville. Thomas roused Catherine, who had dozed against his shoulder for the past hour. The small town's lights flickered in the distance, a constellation of yellow pinpricks against the prairie darkness. "We'll need to be quick," Thomas said, gathering their few belongings. "Find another train east before Hawthorne's men spot us." Catherine nodded, smoothing her rumpled dress as best she could. They had discussed their plan during the long journey. Slip from the freight car while the train took on water. Avoid the station where watchful eyes might be waiting. Find another way east. As the train slowed on its approach to Granville, Thomas slid the freight car door open wider, cold night air rushing in. The rail yard appeared first, a maze of tracks, switching stations, and storage buildings. Perfect for their purpose. "Ready?" Thomas asked as the train's brakes squealed, slowing them further. Catherine took a deep breath and nodded, her face resolute in the lantern light. The moment the train's speed dropped enough, Thomas jumped, landing in a roll on the gravel beside the tracks. He turned immediately, arms outstretched, as Catherine followed more gracefully. They crouched low, watching as the train continued its slow journey into the station proper. No shouts of alarm came. No one had seen their exit. "This way," Thomas whispered, leading Catherine between rows of empty freight cars sitting on side tracks. The main station glowed with light 100 yards ahead, but they circled wide around it, keeping to shadows. "What now?" Catherine asked when they reached a small maintenance shed at the yard's edge. Thomas peered around the corner. "Jenkins said there's an eastbound passenger train at midnight, for hours from now." "We can't wait at the station," Catherine said. "Hawthorne's men will be watching." "No," Thomas agreed. "But we need to know if that train is running on schedule, and we need tickets." Catherine reached into her coat pocket and withdrew a small purse. "Father always said to keep emergency money hidden where thieves wouldn't look." She smiled slightly. "My hairpins were hollow." Thomas raised an eyebrow, impressed. "Clever. But we still need information, and neither of us can show our faces in that station." "What about there?" Catherine pointed to a small building across the street from the rail yard. A tavern by the looks of it, with warm light spilling from its windows and the sounds of piano music floating on the night air. "Railroad men drink there between shifts," Thomas guessed. "Good thinking." They made their way carefully through back alleys until they reached the tavern's rear entrance. A quick glance inside showed a crowded room full of working men, railroad employees, ranch hands, and local townspeople enjoying Saturday night revelry. "Wait here," Thomas said. "I'll see what I can learn." Catherine caught his arm. "Be careful. You stand out in those mountain clothes." Thomas glanced down at his worn coat and trapper's boots. She was right. He looked nothing like the typical Granville resident. But they had no other options. Drawing a deep breath, Thomas pushed open the door and stepped into the noisy tavern. The wall of sound hit him first, dozens of conversations, laughter, the clinking of glasses, and a slightly out-of-tune piano in the corner. The smell of beer, unwashed bodies, and tobacco smoke assaulted his senses next. 15 years of solitude had not prepared him for this level of humanity. Thomas made his way to the bar, keeping his head down. The bartender, a burly man with enormous mustaches, eventually noticed him. "What'll it be, stranger?" "Whiskey," Thomas replied, placing a coin on the counter. "And information." The bartender's eyebrow raised, but he poured the drink without comment. "Midnight train to Chicago," Thomas continued quietly. "Still running on schedule?" The bartender glanced at the clock on the wall. "Far as I know. Got delayed west of here by that blizzard, but it's making up time. Supposed to arrive 11:30, depart midnight sharp." Thomas nodded his thanks, sipping the fiery liquid. It burned all the way down, his body unaccustomed to hard liquor after years of abstinence. He coughed slightly, earning amused looks from nearby patrons. "Tickets?" he asked when he recovered. "Station office. Or you can buy a board if you're in a hurry, but it'll cost extra." Thomas was turning to leave when a newspaper on the bar caught his eye. The headline read, Chicago steel magnate's death-ruled heart failure. Partner Hawthorne takes control. Below was a smaller headline. Heiress Catherine Winfield missing foul play suspected. And there, on the front page, was Catherine's photograph. Snowflakes drifted lazily past gas lamps, transforming Chicago's grimy air into something magical, if only for a moment. The city sprawled beneath a white blanket that couldn't quite hide its rough edges. Smokestacks still belched their dark offerings to the winter sky. Carriage wheels still churned the streets to muddy slush, and the cries of newsboys still cut through the evening calm. Extra, extra. Hawthorne Steel announces record profits. New contracts signed with Union Pacific. The voice echoed across the train platform as Catherine and Thomas stepped from the private compartment they'd occupied for the final leg of their journey. 2 weeks had passed since their narrow escape from Granville, 2 weeks of careful travel, false names, and constant vigilance. Catherine adjusted her widow's veil, the black fabric hiding her too recognizable face. Thomas walked beside her, clean-shaven for the first time in 15 years, dressed in a respectable suit purchased in St. Paul. With his silver-streaked dark hair and somber expression, he looked every inch the proper brother escorting his bereaved sister. "We made it," Catherine whispered, squeezing his hand briefly. Thomas nodded, his eyes constantly scanning the crowded station. "Don't celebrate yet. We're in Hawthorne's territory now." They moved through the busy terminal, 2 figures among hundreds, unremarkable and unnoticed. Outside, Thomas hailed a cab, giving the driver an address not in the wealthy Lake Shore Drive district where Catherine had grown up, but in a modest neighborhood on the city's north side. "Aunt Matilda's house," Catherine explained as they settled into the cab. "Mother's sister. She's been in Europe for the past year. The house is closed up, but I have a key." Thomas watched the city roll past the window, memories flooding back with each familiar landmark. 15 years had changed Chicago dramatically. It had grown taller, wider, more frantic in its energy. Yet beneath the new facades, he could still see traces of the city he'd fled after Sarah's death. "Strange to be back?" Catherine asked softly, reading his expression. "Like visiting a dream," Thomas admitted. "Familiar but not quite real." The cab turned down a tree-lined street of comfortable brownstones, stopping before a well-maintained house with curtained windows. Catherine paid the driver while Thomas retrieved their single small bag, all they had accumulated during their journey. No lights shone from within the house as Catherine unlocked the front door. The interior smelled of dust and abandonment, furniture draped with white cloths like silent ghosts. Catherine moved with certainty through the darkened rooms, lighting a lamp in the parlor. "We can stay here tonight," she said. "Tomorrow, we'll need to find a way to reach Lake Geneva without being noticed." Thomas nodded, removing his coat. "We should contact the authorities about Cooper." "Not yet," Catherine cautioned. "We don't know who to trust. Hawthorne has influence everywhere." A noise from the kitchen made them both freeze. Thomas moved instantly, placing himself between Catherine and the potential threat, reaching for a weapon he no longer carried. "Catherine? Is that you, child?" An elderly woman appeared in the doorway, her silver hair arranged neatly beneath a small cap, her black dress immaculate despite the late hour. Catherine gasped in recognition. "Mrs. Pemberton." The woman smiled, relief flooding her lined face. "Oh, my dear girl, when we read about your disappearance, I feared the worst." Her sharp eyes turned to Thomas. "And who is this gentleman?" "This is Dr. Thomas Blackwood," Catherine said. "A dear friend who's been helping me. Thomas, this is Mrs. Pemberton, our housekeeper from Lake Shore Drive." "But what are you doing here?" Mrs. Pemberton gestured for them to sit. "After Mr. Hawthorne dismissed the staff, I had nowhere to go. Your Aunt Matilda had given me a key years ago to check on the house during her travels. I've been living in the servants' quarters, hoping you might come here eventually." "Dismissed the staff?" Catherine repeated, shocked. "He has no right." "He has every right, according to the papers he showed us," Mrs. Pemberton said grimly. "Documents with your father's signature giving him control of everything if anything happened to Mr. Winfield." She leaned forward, But they're forgeries. I know your father's signature. I handled his correspondence for 20 years. Thomas and Catherine exchanged glances. More evidence of Hawthorne's crimes, but still nothing concrete enough to prove murder. Mrs. Pemberton, Thomas said carefully, how much do you know about Edward Winfield's death? The housekeeper's eyes filled with tears. I know it wasn't his heart, no matter what those doctors said. Mr. Winfield was as healthy as a horse. She reached into her pocket, withdrawing a small key. The night before he died, he gave me this. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure Miss Catherine received it. Catherine took the key with trembling fingers. What does it open? A box in his private study. One I've never seen before. Mrs. Pemberton's voice lowered. Mr. Hawthorne searched every inch of that house, but he never found it. Because it isn't there. Where then? Thomas asked. Mrs. Pemberton smiled. The summer house. In the false bottom of the desk that belonged to Mrs. Winfield. Mr. Winfield had it built specially after her passing. Said it was where he kept his most precious memories. Hope flared in Catherine's eyes. We need to get to Lake Geneva immediately. Not tonight, Thomas cautioned. We're exhausted, and traveling in darkness would draw attention. He turned to Mrs. Pemberton. Can you arrange transportation for tomorrow? Something discreet. The housekeeper nodded firmly. My nephew drives a delivery wagon for Marshall Fields. He makes regular trips to the resort towns. I can ask him to take you. As Mrs. Pemberton bustled off to prepare rooms and a late supper, Catherine sank onto the sofa, the key clutched tightly in her hand. We're so close, she whispered. After everything, we're so close to the truth. Thomas sat beside her, his own weariness evident in the slump of his shoulders. One more day, he agreed. Then we end this. The Marshall Fields delivery wagon rattled along the lakeside road, its canvas cover protecting the occupants from curious eyes and light snow. Catherine and Thomas sat among crates of fine linens and imported foods bound for the wealthy families who maintained summer houses along Lake Geneva's shores. Mrs. Pemberton's nephew, Caleb, proved a taciturn but reliable driver, asking no questions about his unusual passengers. When Catherine had offered to pay him, he'd refused gruffly. Mrs. P. has been good to my family, was all he said. Happy to help hers. The journey took most of the day, the wagon moving steadily north through small towns and past frozen fields. By late afternoon, they caught glimpses of Lake Geneva through the trees, its surface a sheet of solid ice stretching to the horizon. Almost there, Catherine said, unable to keep the nervous excitement from her voice. The Winfield summer house stood on a wooded point extending into the lake, isolated from its neighbors by tall pines and carefully maintained privacy. As the wagon approached, Catherine leaned forward anxiously, searching for signs of occupation or watchful eyes. The house appeared deserted, windows shuttered against winter, the broad veranda heaped with undisturbed snow. No smoke rose from any of the 3 chimneys. Looks clear, Thomas observed. But we should be careful. Hawthorne might have someone watching. Caleb stopped the wagon at the entrance to the long drive. I'll wait here, he said. If you're not back in 2 hours, I'll come looking. Thomas helped Catherine down from the wagon, and together they trudged through knee-deep snow toward the house. Built in the fashionable Queen Anne style, with turrets and gingerbread trim, the cottage was actually a substantial 3-story structure designed for summer entertaining. Catherine led the way to a side entrance, using a key from her purse to unlock the kitchen door. The interior was cold and still, furniture draped with cloths, the smell of mothballs and closed rooms hanging in the air. Mother's study is upstairs, Catherine said, moving quickly through the silent house. 2nd floor, overlooking the lake. They climbed the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing on marble, then crossed a gallery lined with family portraits. Catherine paused briefly before one showing a beautiful woman seated beside a stern-looking Edward Winfield, a young Catherine standing between them. Mother, she said softly, touching the canvas. Father never recovered from losing her. Thomas studied the painting, recognizing in the woman's face the same strength and determination he saw in Catherine. She would be proud of you, he said simply. Catherine smiled, then continued down the hallway to a set of double doors at the end. She pushed them open to reveal a feminine space, pale blue walls, delicate furniture, bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A large desk stood before windows that in summer would offer views across the sparkling lake. Now, winter twilight filtered through lace curtains, casting the room in shades of blue and gray. Catherine moved directly to the desk, running her hands across its polished surface. "The false bottom must be here somewhere," she murmured, opening drawers and examining their construction. Thomas joined her, his physician's trained eye noting details. "This drawer is shallower than it should be," he observed, pulling out the central drawer completely. Catherine peered into the empty space. "There!" she exclaimed, pointing to a tiny keyhole nearly invisible against the dark wood. With trembling fingers, she inserted Mrs. Pemberton's key. It turned with a satisfying click, and the bottom of the drawer space lifted slightly. Thomas carefully removed the false panel, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside lay a leather-bound journal and a stack of papers tied with blue ribbon. Catherine reached for them with reverent hands, as though touching her father's final message. She opened the journal first, flipping through pages filled with Edward Winfield's meticulous handwriting. "His health diary," she explained to Thomas. "Father recorded everything: meals, exercise, symptoms, medications." She turned to the final entries. "Look here, the week before he died. Unusual metallic taste after dinner. Slight numbness in fingers. Mentioned to James, but he suggested indigestion." Thomas took the journal, his medical training allowing him to interpret what Edward Winfield could not. "These are symptoms of arsenical poisoning," he said grimly. "Small doses over time, probably in his food or drink." "Hawthorne was poisoning him," Catherine whispered, horror and vindication mingling in her voice. "These entries alone aren't proof," Thomas cautioned. "What's in those other papers?" Catherine untied the ribbon, spreading the documents across the desk. What they revealed made even Thomas, who had thought himself beyond shock, catch his breath. Financial records, formulas, secret correspondence with government officials, and most damning of all, letters in James Hawthorne's own handwriting discussing sabotage of safety tests, bribery of inspectors, and the unfortunate necessity of silencing workers who had witnessed dangerous shortcuts. "This is everything," Catherine said, her voice thick with emotion. "Everything Father was gathering against Hawthorne. With this, we can prove not just his murder, but all the crimes Hawthorne committed against the workers." Thomas gathered the papers carefully. "We need to get these to the proper authorities immediately." A slow handclap from the doorway froze them both. "Bravo," said James Hawthorne, stepping into the room with a pistol held casually in his gloved hand. "I was beginning to think you'd never find Edward's little treasure." Behind him stood two men, Reed and another of his agents from the trading post. Both were armed. "How did you find us?" Thomas demanded, instinctively moving to place himself between Catherine and the weapons. Hawthorne smiled coldly. "Chicago is my city, Doctor. I have eyes everywhere. The moment you stepped off that train, I knew." He gestured toward the papers. "I'll take those now." "No," Catherine said firmly, clutching the documents to her chest. "These prove you murdered my father. Poisoned him slowly to take control of his company." "Such dramatic accusations," Hawthorne sighed. "Edward had a heart condition he hid from everyone, including his beloved daughter. These papers prove nothing except that he was becoming increasingly paranoid in his final days." Thomas studied the man carefully. Despite his confident words, tension showed around Hawthorne's eyes, in the tight grip on his pistol. He was worried. "These will be examined by federal authorities," Thomas said. "Cooper's colleagues are already investigating you." Something dangerous flashed in Hawthorne's eyes. "Marshal Cooper is no longer a concern," he said softly. "Just as you two will no longer be concerns after your tragic accident." "What accident?" Catherine demanded. Hawthorne gestured to the window overlooking the frozen lake. "Winter is treacherous. A grief-stricken daughter, still mourning her father, ventures onto thin ice. Her devoted friend tries to save her. Both are sadly lost. Reed moved forward, reaching for Catherine. Thomas reacted instantly, driving his shoulder into the man's chest and sending him staggering backward. The second man aimed his pistol, but Catherine was faster, throwing the heavy journal at his face. The momentary distraction was enough for Thomas to grab Reed's dropped weapon. Hawthorne remained unervingly calm as the two men faced each other across the elegant room, each now armed. "You won't shoot me, Doctor," Hawthorne said confidently. "You're a healer, not a killer. It's not in your nature." "You're right," Thomas admitted. Then, without warning, he shifted his aim and fired at the ceiling. The crystal chandelier shattered, raining glass and plunging the room into near darkness. In the confusion, Thomas grabbed Catherine's hand and pulled her toward a side door he'd noticed earlier. They burst through it into a connecting room, then down a servant's corridor that Catherine navigated with childhood familiarity. Behind them, Hawthorne's enraged voice ordered his men to follow. Footsteps pounded on hardwood, gaining on them as they raced through the darkening house. "Back door!" Catherine gasped as they descended a narrow staircase. Through the kitchen, they emerged into the snow just as Reed appeared at the top of the stairs. A bullet splintered the doorframe inches from Thomas's head as they fled toward the trees. "The lake," Catherine said suddenly, changing direction. "We can cross to the Morgan's house on the other point. It's faster than going around by the road." Thomas hesitated. "The ice." "It's February in Wisconsin," Catherine replied. "The ice is 3 feet thick." They plunged onto the frozen surface, leaving the shelter of trees behind. The expanse of white stretched before them, the opposite shore a distant line of dark pines. Their footprints left perfect tracks in the light snow covering the ice impossible to hide. Thomas glanced back to see Hawthorne and his men emerging from the house, spreading out to cut off escape routes. One headed directly for the lake, following their trail. "Keep going," Thomas urged, helping Catherine across the slippery surface. "I'll slow them down." "No!" Catherine clutched his arm. "We stay together." The crack of a pistol emphasized her words as a bullet struck the ice nearby. Reed was closing the distance, firing as he came. Thomas made a split-second decision. Pulling Catherine down behind a small pressure ridge in the ice, he aimed carefully and fired at the pursuing man. Reed dove for cover, buying them precious seconds. "Run for those trees," Thomas directed, pointing to a small island perhaps 200 yards away. "I'm right behind you." Catherine hesitated only briefly before sprinting across the ice. Thomas followed, turning occasionally to fire warning shots that kept their pursuers at a distance. As they neared the island, Thomas risked a longer look back. What he saw chilled him more than the bitter air. Hawthorne had obtained a rifle from somewhere and was taking careful aim not at them, but at the ice surrounding them. "Catherine, down!" Thomas shouted, diving forward to tackle her just as the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the ice with a peculiar thwack, followed by an ominous cracking sound. A second shot, then a third, each strategically placed. "He's breaking the ice," Catherine realized in horror. Thomas pulled her up. "Run. Straight line to the island. Don't stop." They raced forward as more shots rang out behind them. The ice groaned and shifted beneath their feet, fractures spreading like spider webs across the frozen surface. Just as they reached the island's rocky shore, a final massive crack split the air. Looking back, they saw a channel of dark water opening between them and the mainland, effectively cutting off pursuit, but also their escape. "He's stranded us?" Catherine gasped, clutching Thomas's arm. Surrounded by water too cold to swim, Thomas scanned the small island, little more than an acre of rocks and pines. No buildings, no shelter, no boats in winter. The temperature was dropping as night approached, and they had no supplies. "Hawthorne won, didn't he?" Catherine said softly, the fight draining from her voice. "We'll freeze here, just like he planned." Thomas looked at the woman beside him, this remarkable woman who had entered his life like a storm, awakening feelings he thought long dead. Then he looked at the papers still clutched in her hand, the truth they had fought so hard to find. "No," he said firmly. "This isn't over." From his pocket, he withdrew a small metal object, the signal mirror from his doctor's kit, one of the few items he'd kept from his wilderness supplies. "The mainland over there," he said, pointing across the lake in the opposite direction from Hawthorne. "There are houses along that shore, people who might see a signal." As the last rays of sunset struck the lake, Thomas angled the mirror carefully, sending flashes of reflected light toward the distant houses. Again and again he signaled, until his arms ached and darkness made it impossible to continue. "Now we wait," he told Catherine, leading her into the shelter of the pines. "And we survive." They huddled together for warmth, the precious documents secured inside Catherine's coat. As stars appeared in the clear winter sky, Thomas found himself thinking not of their peril, but of the journey that had brought them here. From his solitary cabin to this moment, something fundamental had changed within him. "Catherine," he said softly, "if we don't." She pressed her fingers to his lips, stopping the words. "We will," she said firmly. "We've come too far to fail now." Across the dark water, a pinpoint of light appeared on the distant shore. Then another. Lanterns moving along the shoreline toward them. "They saw us," Catherine breathed, hope returning to her voice. As they watched, the lights multiplied, joined by the unmistakable glow of torches. Help was coming. Whether they would arrive in time to save 2 people from the bitter cold of a Wisconsin February night remained to be seen. But for the first time since James Hawthorne had appeared in the summer house doorway, Thomas allowed himself to believe they might succeed after all. Catherine's hand found his in the darkness, warm despite everything. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "finding you was worth it." Thomas squeezed her hand gently, finally understanding what he had been hiding from all those years in the mountains. Life's greatest pain came not from failure, but from never trying at all. "No," he corrected softly. "I'm the one who was found." Spring sunshine bathed Chicago's courthouse steps in golden light as Catherine emerged from the massive doors, Thomas at her side. Behind them followed a stream of reporters, shouting questions and scribbling notes. "Miss Winfield, how does it feel to see justice served? Dr. Blackwood, will you be returning to medical practice in Chicago?" Catherine paused at the top of the steps, her blue dress bright against the gray stone, her hand firmly clasped in Thomas's. 3 months had passed since that night on the frozen lake, 3 months of testimony, evidence, and finally, today, conviction. "Justice has been served," she stated clearly, her voice carrying to the gathered crowd. "Not just for my father, but for all the workers who suffered from Mr. Hawthorne's criminal negligence." The headline in that morning's Tribune said it all. "Hawthorne found guilty of murder and fraud. Steel magnate faces life imprisonment." Thomas remained silent beside her, uncomfortable with the attention yet steadfast in his support. The hermit doctor had gradually returned to the world of men during the trial, his testimony about Edward Winfield's poisoning proving crucial to the case. As they descended the steps, a familiar figure awaited them, Marshal Cooper, leaning on a cane but very much alive. The federal agent had survived Hawthorne's interrogation, rescued by colleagues who followed Thomas's telegraphed information to the trading post. "Well done, both of you," Cooper said warmly as they reached him. "Edward Winfield would be proud." "What happens now?" Thomas asked. "To the company?" Catherine smiled, a look of quiet determination on her face. "Winfield Steel returns to its rightful ownership, and the safety improvements father designed will be implemented immediately in all our factories." "And what about you, Doctor?" Cooper asked. "Still planning to return to those mountains?" Thomas glanced at Catherine, something unspoken passing between them. "No," he said softly. "I think my hermit days are finished." A carriage waited at the curb to carry them away from the courthouse circus. As they settled inside, Catherine finally allowed herself to relax, the tension of the trial visibly draining from her shoulders. "I can hardly believe it's over," she said. "Sometimes I still expect to wake up freezing in that cabin, or running for our lives across the ice." Thomas smiled, the expression now coming more naturally to him after months in Catherine's company. Not a dream, though sometimes I wonder if that blizzard brought me more than just a half-frozen woman on my doorstep. What do you mean? Catherine asked, though the softness in her eyes suggested she already knew. I think it brought me back to life, Thomas said simply. 15 years I spent hiding from failure, from loss. Then you arrived and showed me there are things worth fighting for, worth living for. The carriage turned onto Lake Shore Drive, following the shoreline toward the Winfield mansion, Catherine's home, once more. In the distance, smoke rose from the steel mills that lined the river, but the new filtration systems Catherine had ordered installed already showed their effect. The smoke was lighter, cleaner. Father would have loved to see this, Catherine said, following his gaze. His vision becoming reality. He does see it, Thomas replied. Through you. The carriage slowed as they approached the mansion's gates. Before it came to a complete stop, Catherine turned to face Thomas fully. You never answered Cooper's question properly, she said. What will you do now? Chicago General has offered you a position. Your old colleagues were most impressed by your testimony. Thomas took her hands in his. I've spent enough time dwelling in the past, he said. I think it's time to look toward the future. And what does that future hold? Dr. Blackwood? Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Instead of answering with words, Thomas leaned forward slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that felt both like completion and beginning. When they separated, Thomas smiled at the woman who had brought him in from the cold in more ways than one. The future holds whatever we choose to build together, he said simply. If you'll have a broken old doctor who's finally learning to heal himself. Catherine's answer shone in her eyes before she spoke it aloud. I wouldn't have anyone else. The carriage stopped before the mansion's grand entrance, where Mrs. Pemberton waited on the steps, beaming with pride at the young woman who had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged victorious. As Thomas helped Catherine from the carriage, he glanced up at the clear spring sky. Somewhere, he imagined, Sarah and Elizabeth were at peace, perhaps even smiling down on this unexpected new chapter in his life. The past would always be there, with its joys and sorrows. But for the first time in 15 years, Thomas Blackwood looked forward to tomorrow with hope instead of dread. Sometimes, he reflected as he followed Catherine into her home that would soon be theirs together. The most devastating storms bring unexpected gifts. And sometimes, saving someone from freezing in the cold turns out to be your own salvation.